Imagine living at odds with the world around you, a life of obstacles at every turn, abandoned by family, denied an education, slighted by society. This scratches the surface of hardships faced by our first hero. The struggles and achievements of Deborah Sampson Gannett are distinctly unique. As the first woman to enlist, to fight in, and to be honorably discharged from the American military, Mrs. Sampson disguised herself in men's attire and used an alias to enlist. She fought bravely in a Revolutionary War, which would change the balance of global power. Mrs. Deborah Sampson Gannett had no choice but to grow up quickly in the Mass Bay colony, making crucial life decisions which put her name, her reputation, and her life at risk. She earned the title, the American Heroine, and was honored as the official heroine of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1983. Portraying Mrs. Deborah Sampson Gannett is Mrs. Judith Kalaora, a local actress and historical interpreter. Judith has focused her energies on historical education for nearly a decade and is honored to bring this revolutionary American to life. And now, Mrs. Deborah Sampson Gannett.
As I was walking through the common land of Boston on a beautiful spring day, I told a young child of my story, the story of Deborah Sampson and of Robert Shirtliff. The young child told me, "You are like America's Mulan." So there you have it. If I remind you of Huya Mulan, or perhaps Shakespeare's Portia in The Merchant of Venice, or any other brave female who dared to cross gender lines, I am the American heroine. I am the first woman to enlist, to fight in, and to be honorably discharged from the Continental Army. I received a pension for my military service. I survive as the official heroine of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the place that I have called my home since the days when we were just the Mass Bay colony. There are very few women who can tell the story of the battleground as I can. But those who can know that those stories are often gruesome and even intriguing and inspiring. Some 230 years after I enlisted in the military, women are still not afforded the opportunity to fight on the battleground. The deafening shot of musket fire, the screams of my fallen brothers, the nauseating smell of brimstone, and the black smoke which filled the air. That smoke was so black I couldn't see in front of my own nose, and that black smoke, every time I tried to breathe, it was produced nothing but a hacking cough. But these terrifying stories are stories for another day. Though I may not be the only woman to experience battle, I am one of the first, and I almost didn't make it, in more ways than one. As a child of just 5 years old, I was cast out by my family, forced into indentured servitude. My mother, she could not afford to pay her debts, and I paid them for her. First as a seamstress's apprentice, and then later I was sent to the home of Deacon Jeremiah Thomas to work as a farmhand. Sun up to sundown, grueling, toiling. I worked in the fields doing a man's job, man's labor, but I am a woman. And I was denied the right to the most basic things like an education. Had it not been for the 10 sons of Deacon Thomas coming home every day and sharing their lessons with me, I don't know where I would be. I hungrily learned everything they taught me. I hungrily read every book I could find. But still I was a second-class citizen. What would the military offer me? Opportunities beyond my wildest imagination, a career, financial assistance, learning skills that I could never have imagined. So, one day when I was nearly 20, I mustered up my courage and I went to a local tavern. As I signed the name, Timothy Thayer, my hand was shaking, the sweat was pouring from my palms. I'm certain as that enlistment officer looked at me, he knew who I was, and I was a coward. I failed to report for duty the very next day. But a few weeks later, I would summon up my courage once again, and I would walk from my Middleborough farm all the way to Bellingham, Massachusetts, and go to a tavern. And I stood before the enlistment officer, and I told him, I want to join the army for the balance of the war. I picked up the feather quill, and with my left hand and my broken finger, which I could never properly bend from an injury sustained on the farm, I wrote my name, Robert Shirtleaf. Now the stories of battle and how I was discovered and my honorable discharge are stories for another day. Today, I'd like to tell you more about what happened after my military service. Because I had served for 18 months as a man, as a first-class citizen, and now I had to return to the role of a woman. I decided to go home to my mother, whom I had not seen since I was nearly 5 years old. And when I knocked on the door, she opened, and it was not the face of a loving mother. No, it was disgust and hatred and apathy and just pure and utter dislike. My mother knew what I had done, and she hated me for it. She disowned me, and once again, I was an orphan. Not long after, I had the fortune to meet a young man, a young farmer, Mr. Benjamin Gannett. We married, we had 3 children, and adopted a 4th daughter, Susanna. She was an orphan. I felt a kindred spirit to her as I had grown as an orphan myself. But my dear husband, Benjamin, he just did not have a knack for business. No matter how hard he tried, finances never were in our favor. And so once again, I shirked the roles of a woman. I had to find work. I began to speak, to lecture, to give speeches about my experience in the military. They billed me as the American heroine. I was the first female professional speaker. I even spoke at the Federal Street Theater in Boston. How can I stand before you now, a second-class citizen, when I was the best soldier in my regiment? I watched this world change. I went from being a British citizen to an American one. I went from watching the flag waving overhead from a grand Union flag to the stars and stripes. Yet long after we overthrew the oppression of King George III, that fatso, I was still oppressed. Women everywhere were still oppressed. I stand before you now as a second-class citizen, though I was the best soldier in my regiment. How can I be denied an education when my marksman skills were the best of those around me? How can I live the life of a second-class citizen just because I wear this mob cap and these petticoats? Why can I not hold a job or own property? I dare to break free of these shackles and these chains without this mob cap, do I seem more deserving to you? When I wear a soldier's canteen and a possibles bag, do I now seem more a man to you? How about when I drape my continental jacket over my shoulder like so? Am I more deserving now? How do these garments entitle me the right to vote when my sisters are denied these rights and freedoms? These are questions I pose to you. Are my accomplishments so great for a woman? Are they so outlandish? When we meet again, we will discuss the colonial society in which I grew up. We will discuss how they rationalized this gender caste system, which I risked my life to defy. I am Deborah Sampson Gannett. I am your daughter of liberty, and I am your son of liberty. I am your American heroine.
An unknown frontier lawyer, when he threw his hat into the presidential ring in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was considered by many a country bumpkin given to storytelling. But his stories went beyond humor, relieving stress, and carried his philosophy and his beliefs. A whimsical and devoted family man, a shrewd and determined politician, a private and troubled individual burdened by personal loss and national tragedy. Lincoln's life experience honed him into the able and innovative commander-in-chief who guided us through the ultimate national crisis, the American Civil War. Lincoln expressed difficult concepts in simple yet profound language, reaching the common man. His intellect, coupled with his deep humanity, made him the definitive leader of our nation. He preserved the Union. Even the defeated Southerners felt his influence, many of whom soon realized at his untimely death that they had lost perhaps their best friend. Presenting Lincoln here is Philip Chetwynd, who began portraying Lincoln in 1987 in performances from Virginia to Maine, from the Cub Scouts to the White House, under the name Lincoln for the Ages.
I recall that when I ran for president in 1860, I was solicited by the newspapers for an ancestry in my family. I had to tell them that I don't know much about my ancestry other than the fact that my grandfather was killed by Indians while settling on a piece of land in Kentucky. I know this because my father saw him killed and told me. Myself, I was brought into this world in February of 1809. I led a very simple life as a child, as our family didn't have much money. I went to school in what I call littles, a little here and a little there. And the reason for that was quite often I would be kept out of school so I could tend to chores back at the homestead. Now, there are a couple of incidents which happened to me as a boy for which I was fortunate enough to survive. Once was when I was playing with my friend Austin down by the creek, and I fell in, and I immediately began to drown since I never could swim a lick. Well, poor Austin became greatly distraught, and he managed to get a stick just long enough to reach out and snag my shirt and pull me in. Rolled me around on the ground for a couple of minutes and got the water out of my lungs, saved my life. The other incident was when I had taken some grain down to the mill to grind it, and I got kicked in the head by a horse. I was giving the horse the command, "Get up, old hussy, get up, old hussy." I went, "Get up," and the horse kicked me. They say the first words out of my mouth 3 days later were, "Old hussy," which is the rest of the command I'd been giving the horse. Well, we moved a couple of times when I was a boy. Once was when we moved from Kentucky to Indiana. And when we arrived in Indiana, we were quite happy for a year or two. And then my mother took ill in 1818 with something called the milk sickness. Now, the milk sickness is when the cows get out into the woods and eat a particular type of root called snake root. And it contaminates the milk in the cow. Doesn't hurt the cow, but if people milk the cow and drink the milk, they become poisoned. There may be cases of people who have survived milk sickness, but I don't know of any. We moved again when we moved from Indiana to Illinois. And I remember that move because it was in the winter. Father always seemed to be moving us in the winter. Well, as we were traveling along the river, I saw a lot of large pieces of ice floating freely in the river. And I saw that a rather small dog had become trapped on one of the pieces of ice. So I did something for which my father always said I was a bit of a fool. I took off my boots and socks, rolled up my pant legs, and I waded out into the river and rescued the dog. Of course, the dog was quite grateful and licked my face for several minutes, and then we put him down and lost sight of him. Well, shortly after arriving in Illinois, I reached the age of 21. Now, that was important to me because, you see, by law, back then, any money you made at any job you had, when you were under the age of 21, you couldn't keep it. You had to give the money to your parents. So when I reached 21, I went out to live on my own at a place called New Salem. Now, when I got to New Salem, of course, I began to get an interest in a lot of things. I joined a local debating society, went around the countryside making stump speeches, which is just about what it sounds like. You find a tree stump, stand up on it, and start talking. Hopefully somebody will come along that want to hear it. Well, I also got my interest in the law at that time. I began studying the law, got a hold of a book, very basic, and began to study. And eventually I borrowed books from some of the prominent lawyers in the area. I ran a store while I was in New Salem. Of course, the store failed, and it took me some time to pay off all the debts. Well, they even made me postmaster in New Salem. They figured I could handle that since there were only 1 or 2 pieces of mail that came through in a week. Now, I also got my vast military experience in New Salem during the Black Hawk War. I was elected a captain of militia, and to give you an idea what kind of commander I was, I had my troops lined up in a single line moving across the field, and I noticed up ahead a picket fence with a small opening in it. And I couldn't remember what the command was to make them go from one line into columns of 2. And we kept getting closer and closer to the fence. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I hollered, "Halt! Disband and reform on the other side." Well, not much of a military command, but it did achieve the desired effect. There was one thing my friends said to me when I was in New Salem, because I had not been a success at anything, is they said there's always one profession you can get into, and you don't even have to be too smart to do it. Well, I thought that sounded pretty good. I said, "What's that?" They said, "You can get involved in politics." Well, I took them up on that, and I did get involved. I served 4 terms in the Illinois State Legislature. Of course, I didn't do much there but take up space. And I served 1 term in the U.S. Congress. That was under the Polk administration during the Mexican War. I was very unpopular at that time because I did not support the Mexican War. And I also helped introduce legislation which would have abolished slavery in the District of Columbia. So because of these views and them being unpopular, I only served 1 term. And after my term was up, I went back to what was a thriving law practice by then, and never thought I'd get involved in politics again. Of course, one should never say never, because I did get involved in politics again when I ran against my old friend Steve Douglas for his Senate seat in '58. Now, we had a series of debates, 7 in all, in which the main difference between us was that he believed any new territory applying for statehood should be allowed to choose for themselves whether they're slave or free. And I felt any new territory applying for statehood should come in as a free state, stop the extension of slavery, but not interfere with it where it already existed. Now, I lost that election, but because all the newspapers came from all over the country and covered our debates, more people across the country were reading about where I stood on the issues. So, as a result, 2 years later, when the new Republican Party offered me their platform to run for president, I was able to gain the presidency. Now, I think that's a fair exchange. Mr. Douglas got to keep his Senate seat, but I got the presidency. Mr. Douglas and I always seemed to be on opposing sides, whether it was in the courtroom or politically. Why, he was even courting Miss Todd at the same time I was. And I met Miss Todd at a social that was being held by her brother-in-law, Ninian Edwards. And I remember when I was introduced to her, I was quite taken. I told Miss Todd I would like to dance with her in the worst way. Well, she told her friends later that I truly did dance with her in the worst way. Apparently, I stepped on her toes a couple of times. Well, we've had 4 sons. My oldest son, Robert, who was serving with General Grant on his staff. My second son, Eddie, and who was born in '46, and then my third son, William Wallace Lincoln, was born in 1850, the same year that my second son, Eddie, passed away. And then my 4th son was born. His name was Thomas, but I call him Tad because his head is so large in proportion to the rest of his body, he reminds me of a tadpole swimming in the pond. And he's a bit of a rascal. He likes to come in and bring the goats in with him, and they run up and down the halls of the executive mansion, and Mrs. Lincoln chasing him and the goats, trying to get him to go back outside. He even comes into cabinet meetings, and he has his toy gun, and he's yelling, bang, 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 and he's running through the room. He climbs under the table, all over the cabinet members' feet. And they just look at me and get madder and madder because they expect me to do something. I don't do anything. Let them run. Now, my cabinet members, there's an interesting lot of gentlemen. Mr. Seward, when I ran for president in 1860 and I chose him as my Secretary of State, he was at the time the leading Republican. Well, he thought he was going to be the fox in charge of the hen house. Of course, I had to set him straight on that. And then there's my Secretaries of Treasury and War, Secretaries Chase and Stanton, a couple of solemn fellas. But they have mentioned, I remember one time when Mr. Chase had said to Mr. Stanton that he was curious about the pattern of his beard because the hair on his head was so dark, but his beard was so white. I said, I think that's perfectly clear. It means Mr. Stanton uses his jaw more than his head. Stanton laughed even at his own expense. Chase did not. Well, in this struggle, both sides pray to the same God. Yet one would destroy the nation, while I have the solemn duty of preserving it. May God, in his infinite wisdom and mercy, secure a just and lasting peace, that we might once again be one nation under God.
Most books about the American Civil War feature endless battle statistics and highlight famous generals and armies. Rarely do they mention, however, how the work of engineers contributed to the success of those generals and armies. Of over 3,500 regiments, battalions, and companies in the United States military service, only 6% were engineer units. Civil War engineers designed and erected fortifications, surveyed, prepared maps, and built bridges and roads. Private Sam of the 15th New York Engineers now addresses a squadron of fresh recruits, introducing them to tasks and skills in which they will soon become well-versed. Living historian Sally Chetwynd began reenacting in 1975. She developed this engineering role from her work in today's civil engineering profession. Under the name Brass Castle Arts, she also offers computer drafting, historical music, writing and editing, and graphic arts, besides hands-on living history programs.
Welcome. My name is Private Sam Chetwynd. I'm of the 15th New York Engineers. Now put your muskets down over there, stack your muskets. Your tools as engineers are going to be shovels, ruling pens, and surveyors' chains. Now, one of the things we're going to have to do is determine whether or not you folks have any kind of experience at all. Does anybody here have any engineering experience at all? No, we're not going to be driving trains, but we do build bridges for the railroad. What about my maritime experience? Oh, good. You're going to be able to help me show the rest of these folks how to do knots and lashing. Can you all read, write, and do your ciphering? Good. That's very important. Now, one of the things that we're going to have to learn is that with surveying, we need to be able to survey things because we don't know the territory in these parts very much. The reason for that is we've got this war going on, and here we are stationed in the South. We've got people from all over the country descended in these various armies, and they're from Minnesota. They don't know where anything is. General Grant, for example, he's from Illinois. Unless he has a map, unless we go out and survey and determine what's going on around here, he doesn't know if that stream down there is the Rappahannock or the Rapidan. So we're going to be learning how to do surveying. One of the things that's important is learning to measure. This is a surveyor's chain. This is actually a half chain. A full chain is 66 feet long. It's made up of 100 links. Each link is 7.92 inches in length. 100 links makes up 66 feet, and 80 chains makes up a mile. And if I need to measure something that's a lot longer than my 66 feet or my 33 feet, I set this pin in the ground. I can put the end of it right over that, measure it out, stick another pin. I got all kinds of these pins. Stick another pin in the ground, come back, leave the one pin, pick up the end of the chain, swing it around, and keep on going in the direction that I want to go. These surveyor's chains are marked with little lobes so that you don't have to worry, especially with a 100 link one, you don't have to worry about forgetting if somebody interrupts you, whether you were on 39 or 42. Each one of these lobes marks a 10-link distance. So this one's 3 lobes, 4 lobes, 2 lobes. So that's how you tell where you are. Makes it a lot easier to add these things up. Now, one thing that you're going to have to be learning how to do is riding in the saddle and taking notes. You'll acquire a horse, and you go down, you measure that horse's step, this tread. You measure how far that tread is, and you mark it in your notebook. This is going to be very important because when you're sitting on the horse and you're riding through the countryside and you're taking notes about what's in the neighborhood, what kind of trees you've got, what kind of crossings, what kind of a road, you're mentally counting how many steps that horse is taking. Then when you get back to camp and you've got to draw your map, you can mark that up, you can multiply by that horse length, that horse pace. And you'll see on a lot of these initial sketches, so many horse paces from this corner to that corner. So that's one of the things you're going to have to learn. It comes automatically after a while. Now, when you get back to camp and you want to make your map, you're going to have drafting tools. Now, the topographer's tent has all these supplies. You can go down there, draw your maps up. They have maps of the area, what is available, and you determine from your resources what other materials are available. The Coast Survey has very good maps of the lands along the seacoast. They don't have much for inland, but troops coming in from the field, they're able to tell you what they've seen. You can talk to locals, sometimes captured prisoners, and will be able to tell you what's going on. You're going to draw your map. Your first map you're going to draw in pencil, and then you will ink it because it's a lot easier to draw it in pencil when you make your mistakes. Once you've inked it, you're not going to be able to correct it very readily. So this is something that's called a ruling pen. It's 2 blades. You can probably see that. 2 blades. It has a little adjusting screw, so you can open those blades and close those blades. And you take an eyedropper, which I seem to have misplaced here, dip the eyedropper into the inkwell. There's my inkwell. And then you drop that eyedropper of ink right in between those 2 blades. And that allows you to fill the pen. Then you can draw your lines. Drafting and drawing, you've heard of draft horses. It's a term, drawing is pulling. So when you're drawing on a map, you're literally pulling the pen. So that's where we get that term, drafting. Draft horses pull wagons. Draftsmen pull pens. So we'll look at a couple of maps here. We've got a number of maps. This is a completed one of Fredericksburg area. We had a big battle down there back in '82. These items you see here, all these little marks, these are called hatchers. Now these indicate elevation. If they're close together, they indicate a steep slope. If they're more broadly separated, they indicate a more shallow slope. We don't have a sense from these maps of how high above sea level, for example, that we may be. But we get a sense of the relative elevation over an area that may be down near the water's edge, like Fredericksburg here. This is down on the water's edge. During this Battle of Fredericksburg, the Confederates had artillery set up here in Marie's Heights. They had full command of the city. They were able to protect the rebels that were down in this area, and they were shooting at us while we were trying to put our pontoon bridges in. So that made it not very much fun. This is an example of a partially completed map. You can see there's a lot of pencil marks. I've begun inking this one. This is of the Battle of First Bull Run area. Loudoun County, Manassas, the village of Manassas is down in this area. Now you may think that you've gotten a map complete, but and this one was relatively complete, but then afterwards I discovered that there was more information as people came in out of the field and told me, oh, well, here's Thomas Simpson's house over here. So I've marked more information on this map. I can ink it in. This will be valuable if we need to go back into that area later. Now this book here, this is Duane's manual. Captain Duane of the Engineer Corps produced it in 1862, so it's a pretty new book. This will tell you everything you need to know. Now you'll notice I'm merely a private, but you recruits, you're the same rank as I am. But because I have experience, because of this book and the training that it has given me, I have the ability and the authority and the experience to train you folks on how to become engineers. So one of the things that we need to know how to do is when the Army is on the move, we need to be able to cross streams. One of the means by which we do that is through the use of pontoon bridges. And we have whole wagons full of materials by which we can haul bridges with us and put them together. A pontoon is really nothing more than a canvas tent upside down in the water. The canvas is oiled, it has a wooden frame. The canvas is tied to the frame so that it stays together. The whole thing is mortise and tenon construction. You've got the peg in the hole. The pressure of the water helps keep all of that pulled together so it's not going to fall apart on us. We're going to go across the stream perpendicular to the flow. We start out with something called balk. These are very heavy beams. You see some of those up here on the shore. We dig one in as an abutment, fix it with a couple of pins, and then we start putting these boats in the water, one right next to the other. They are facing up and down stream. They're side by side. They go across the stream. Once you've got 2 or 3 or 4 of them there, then you can start putting some more balk across the tops of them on the gunnels. And with ropes, we lash the balks to the pontoons. Then when we've got a few of them out there, we start putting planking down. The planking is called chess. And they're notched so that we can use more rope to lash to the balk. So the chess are lashed to the balk are lashed to the pontoons are anchored to the stream, to the shore, and eventually you get across to the other side and you've got a pretty good bridge. This bridge is stable enough to take artillery, to take infantry, to take cavalry. They can be made double wide. If it's going to be down for any length of time, we put earth on it. It helps protect the wood from wearing out. Now, another thing that Duane's manual is good for is fortifications. If you need to either lay a siege or you need to build a fort, whether you're on the offensive or the defensive, this book tells you a lot of things. When you're going to build a fort, you need to find high ground. And you're going to clear all the area around that ground. And as you're clearing, you end up with an awful lot of lumber. Well, the big stuff can be used to build the fort. Somewhat smaller branches, 3-4 inches in diameter, we're going to use for Chevaux De Fries. Smaller than that, 2 to 3 inches in diameter, we'll use for fraise. Smaller than that, we'll use the supple small branches for gabion building. And then we will use the leftover brush for a bodice. Now, the fraise, which I have a picture of here, these are pointed sticks in the ground. And they're stuck into the ground about 18 inches apart. Now, we don't agree with the enemy about everything, but they're not so stupid that they're going to impale themselves on these. That's not the purpose of these. They're close enough together so when an army approaches the fort, which has rings of these around it, it stops them. They try to get in between, those points get caught on their clothes, under their straps. If they're standing still, you're up in the fort and you can fire right down on them. So that's very, very useful that way. So Chevaux De Fries is a bigger kind of a format of a similar thing. They're against horses. Chevaux means horses in French, and Fries means they came from Friesland, where they were first used, which is a part of the Netherlands. Now, we're beginning to run a little short at this point. It's too bad they sent you over so late. But we will continue tomorrow, and I hope that you'll remember this. The Army, their job is to destroy things. They destroy towns, they destroy enemy troops, they destroy bridges, they destroy supply depots. The engineers' work enables the Army to do its job, but by doing so, we build things. Dismissed.
Ulysses S. Grant was a family man, a dedicated citizen, a military and presidential hero. He loved horses and smoked cigars, but most importantly, he was, from the very beginning, a common man, an essential American. His story of adversity and success remains one of the most inspirational biographies our nation's history has to offer, and deserves to be told with the passion and authentic demeanor of Sam Grant as General Ulysses S. Grant. A highly acclaimed academic and motivational speaker, film producer, and United States Navy veteran, Sam has dedicated the last 20 years of his life to understanding, portraying, and honoring Ulysses S. Grant. His inspiring and informative visits are entirely first person, and all audiences that have engaged him in the past have left with the overwhelming feeling that they have experienced the true General Grant up close and personal, as history should be. General Grant will be introduced by his loving and devoted wife, Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my greatest pleasure to introduce to you this evening your general, your president, your hero, although he will be very angry with me for introducing him as such. For an evening in his honor strikes the greatest fear in his heart. You see, my husband is not gifted in the ways of public speaking, but he is a good soldier and he will rise to the occasion as best he can. for it is his duty this evening to share with you his experience in the Civil War and to honor the soldiers and sailors who fought at his side, the women who supported them, and the land and the Union for which they fought for long and bloody years. But who was this man who brought an end to such a devastating and horrendous war and healed the wounds of the North and South with a wisdom and a kindness and a foresight unknown on leaders of this age or any other? Well, in the words of William Tecumseh Sherman, our dear friend and ally, he says, "Grant is a mystery to me, and I believe he is a mystery unto himself." My husband is the most unlikely of military heroes. He was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio, where he was having a typical frontier boyhood raised among horses, and the foul smells of his father's tannery business always disgusted him, which is why I find it terribly, terribly upsetting to hear the newspapers of our day and age calling him a butcher. There is no other leader in history who cares more about the men who are dying in his army than our General Ulysses S. Grant. But he was not a political person, but he did know how to win battles, and he was a master strategist. In fact, our dear President Lincoln once said of Grant, "I cannot spare this man, he fights," and truer words were never spoken. He was educated at West Point and served bravely in the Mexican War, and upon return we were married near my family home in St. Louis, Missouri. But shortly thereafter, Liz was transferred to garrison outposts on the West Coast, and we missed each other very terribly. So he did resign from the Army and came home to start a civilian life with us. We tried farming, we tried business life, and then war came again to our country's shores. In March of 1864, towards the end of the terrible Civil War, President Lincoln called my husband to Washington City and made him commander of all the federal armies. And as you may know, on April 9th, 1865, General Ulysses S. Grant, in his most moment of history, truly brought to fruition the signing of the terms of surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia. Truly a great moment, and welcomed our Southern soldiers back as countrymen again. In the words of our contemporaries, and I shall quote from them this evening, the general was once described as, and I quote, "brave as any man should be. He is not a brilliant man, but he is a good and brave soldier, sober, tried for years, industrious, and as kind as a child," which is another reason why it deeply concerns me that anyone would remember General Grant as a drunk with a penchant for whiskey. Historical evidence will show that rumors of my husband's alcoholism was simply cooked up by his political enemies at the time. How could someone succeed in so many battles and have that kind of a problem? And in a most endearing manner, I do digress, another newspaper described him as an ordinary, scrubby-looking man with no gait, no station, and no flashy manner. In fact, once a British correspondent once said of Ulysses, and I quote, "I never met a man with so much simplicity, shyness, and decision. He is a soldier to the core, a genuine commoner, a commander of a democratic army, of a democratic people. No more afraid to command 1,000,000 men than a small company." And I will leave you with this parting description of my husband, and I quote, "General Grant was calmer than Sherman by 100-fold. The habitual expression on his face was so quiet as to be almost incomprehensible. In utterance, he was slow and sometimes embarrassed. But his words were well chosen, never leaving the remotest doubt of what he intended to convey. Not a sign about him suggested rank or power. But in battle, the Sphinx awoke. Ladies and gentlemen, General Ulysses S. Grant.
Gentlemen, ladies, being entirely unaccustomed to public speaking and without the desire to cultivate the power, it is impossible for me to find proper language to thank you for your attendance here. All I can say is that to whatever I may be called by your will, I shall endeavor to discharge its duty with fidelity and honesty of purpose. Of my rectitude in the performance of public duty, you will have to judge for yourself by the record before you. I have been quite fortunate in my long life, being blessed by a fine wife for so many years, a loving family. I was blessed that our late president, Mr. Lincoln, saw fit to give me the responsibilities of bringing the rebellion to a final and successful conclusion. On the 26th of February, 1864, the bill restoring the grade of Lieutenant General of the Armies had passed through Congress and become law. My nomination was sent to the Senate on the 1st of March. And the next day, the 2nd, I was confirmed. On the 9th of March, the commission was handed to me at the Executive Mansion by President Lincoln in the presence of his cabinet, my eldest son, Fred, those of my staff who were with me in Washington, and a few other guests. On the following day, March 10th, 1864, I set my headquarters at Culpeper Courthouse in Virginia, determined to find a means to bring the war to a just and honorable close. It took another 13 months, almost to the day, to complete that task. And on the 9th of April, 1865, early in the afternoon, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his Army of Northern Virginia. There was still General Johnston's ragtag army confronting General Sherman in North Carolina and a number of garrisons throughout the South. But Lee's surrender, acceptance of the terms, effectively ended the war. I have been asked on a number of occasions why the war lasted so long, was so hard and so bloody. For myself, I believe it is simply that this war was fought here in America. Americans against Americans. And Americans do not back down from a fight. In this war, the soldiers and sailors who fought it were fighting for the same ideas, the same causes for which their fathers and grandfathers before them had fought. In early 1868, General Sherman, on learning the dilemma I faced when I had been asked if I would allow my name to be placed in nomination for the presidency of the United States. He wrote me regarding his great concern that I should be drawn into the political intrigues of Washington. I had returned a letter to my good friend, my mutual concerns regarding the same subject. But while I did, I told him that I had the same concerns and was thankful of his sentiments. However, I also knew quite clearly that if I did not accept the nomination and we were to allow a politician to run for that office, we might well lose all we had fought 4 long, hard years to gain. For that reason, while I did not wish the office of the presidency of this great country, I felt it my duty to accept the nomination. And I am very proud that you, the people of this country, saw fit to honor me with 8 years, 2 full terms as your president. I feel very much embarrassed in being here before you to say anything in response to the undeserved eulogy which I have just had to hear. However, we have also heard recently some words of little eulogistic of our own country, of our own institutions, of the people who fill the country and make those institutions, a great minority of whom I had the privilege to fight alongside during the late war. And to this, I may say a few words. As you are all undoubtedly aware, I have had the last few years an opportunity to visit most of the civilized nations of this earth. I have had had a very fair opportunity of comparing their governments, their peoples, and their institutions with ours. And I can assure one and all of you that I came back to America better than I went away, I hope. We are blessed with a soil and a variety of climate that no other one nation is blessed of. Our people are made up, I hope, of the best elements of all the countries, mixed up together in a very happy degree to produce about the best results. We are a nation that proceeds on the theory that power is with the people. Our rulers, only servants, having only such power as the people choose to extend to them from time to time. Other nations, I think history will bear me out in saying, have proceeded on the theory that the power is with the head of the government and that the people have no rights, no privileges, except that as they are extended from the crown. We started out with the experience of those other nations and commenced pretty well, considering that apprentices had to boss the job. Now we have grown to manhood, have become of age, have got a history. I think that we, some way or other, will work through any future difficulties that may ever arise, and that we will go down to the end of time an example to those people and furnish a good example which many of them will feel sooner or later. I shall say but little more, except to say I am very much obliged, ladies and gentlemen, for your reception here tonight. Thank you.